The forest stretched on endlessly, its canopy thick with verdant green that filtered the sunlight into soft, golden patches across the ground. Tritan led the group through the twisting paths, their spirits heavy from days of wandering. Solister was supposed to be a short journey from Omeris, but their lack of a reliable map, or sense of direction, had turned it into a frustrating ordeal. Grodd grumbled about his sore feet and the stupidity of wandering in circles, while Lana smirked at his misery, clearly less concerned about their plight. As the sun dipped low, the faint flicker of a campfire caught their attention through the trees.
Someone's camped nearby,
Mesra noted, her sharp elven eyes narrowing.
We should approach carefully.
Carefully?
Grodd snorted.
I say we approach boldly. If it's trouble, we'll give 'em some of their own.
Tritan ignored Grodd's remark and motioned for silence, gesturing for them to follow. They crept closer, their boots crunching softly against the forest floor until they emerged into a small clearing. There, beside a crackling campfire, lay a man sprawled on a bedroll. In one hand he clutched a sword, its blade resting against the ground, and in the other, a half-empty bottle of whiskey. His chest rose and fell steadily, though his posture betrayed a readiness that belied his apparent slumber. The snap of a twig under Ven's boot broke the stillness. The man's eyes shot open, and in an instant the sword was at the ready, its point gleaming in the firelight.
"Who's there?"
He barked, his voice rough but steady.
"Easy. We're travelers. Lost ones at that. We mean you no harm,"
Tritan said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. The man's gaze swept over them, his expression wary, but not hostile. After a tense moment, he lowered the blade and sat up, his movements slow and deliberate.
"Lost, huh?"
He took a swig from his bottle, his eyes never leaving them.
"Well, you found me. Name's Arakos, and you are?"
Tritan introduced the group one by one, keeping his tone even and respectful. When the introductions were done, Arakos leaned back, his lips quirking into a faint smirk.
"A fine group of adventurers, eh? And yet you're wandering aimlessly in these woods. Lucky for you, I'm a guide."
A guide?
Lana asked, arching a skeptical brow.
"Of sorts. I know these woods like the back of my hand. I've helped many commoners and travelers find their way, for a fee, of course."
Tritan considered this, glancing at his companions.
"We're trying to reach Solister. Think you can help us get there? Or at least point the way?"
"Solister, huh? Sure, I can get you there."
Arakos said with confidence. The group huddled together to discuss. Grodd was predictably against it.
We don't need some whiskey-soaked ranger leading us around. We'll find the way ourselves.
Mesra argued otherwise.
We've already lost days wandering aimlessly. If he knows the way, we should take his help.
Besides, it will add to the fun and excitement that we have been lacking these last few days.
Ven replied as he leaned against a nearby tree, taking in some shade. Lana seemed hesitant, but ultimately agreed.
If it saves us time, it's definitely worth it.
"Certainly."
The palm of his hand extends outward, while Arakos smiles at Tritan. The group followed Arakos through the forest, the trees growing taller and more ominous as they pressed on. The ranger moved with an unhurried, confident stride, his boots crunching softly against the pine needles carpeting the ground. His posture exuded ease, but his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, a predator always aware of the hunt. Behind him, the adventurers trudged on, their moods as varied as their personalities. Tritan walked near the front, ever watchful. Mesra glided with a quiet grace, her expression thoughtful as she studied their guide. Ven strolled with his usual careless swagger, occasionally humming a jaunty tune under his breath. Lana remained near the rear, her sharp eyes darting about, her mistrust of Arakos simmering just beneath the surface. Grodd, predictably, was grumbling.
This shortcut of his better be worth it.
Grodd muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear.
Feels like we've been walking in circles.
Arakos glanced back over his shoulder, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips.
"Patience, my dwarven friend. The forest can feel endless if you don't know its secrets. But trust me, I've got us on the right path.
Trust you? The only thing I trust is the steel of my great axe. And even that has more sense than a guide who talks too much.
Talking's part of the job.
Arakos said smoothly, unfazed by the dwarf's outburst.
After all, I like to know who I'm traveling with. Speaking of which...
He let his words hang in the air for a moment, then turned his gaze to Tritan.
Tell me about your companions.
Tritan glanced at Mesra, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. He hesitated briefly, but decided it couldn't hurt to share a little.
We're adventurers from Omeris. We've worked together for a while now.
Well, that much is obvious, but what about the details? Take you, for example. You're obviously an elf. What's your story?
Mesra met his gaze with a calm, measured look.
My name is Mesra. I hail from the woodlands of Lyrian, and I serve the group when needed. But I don't share much beyond that. My focus is on the present.
A mysterious one. Fair enough.
Arakos remarked, his tone almost playful. His eyes shifted to Ven, whose grin widened as though he'd been waiting for his turn.
And what of you, my carefree friend? I'm guessing you are a bard, as I see you carrying a lute who likes to hum a tune.
Entertainer, savior, gambler, occasional instigator.
Ven quipped, spreading his arms theatrically.
Name's Ven, and I'm the one who keeps things interesting around here. Life's too dull without a little flair.
Arakos chuckled.
I can see that. Never met a bard who didn't love the sound of his own voice.
Guilty as charged.
Ven replied with a mock bow.
And the silent one at the back?
Arakos turned his attention to Lana, whose lips curled into a faint smirk.
Kira,
She said, using one of her many aliases.
I do what I need to do.
Short and to the point. I can respect that.
Arakos said, nodding appreciatively. Finally, his gaze landed on Grodd, who was glaring at him as though he were an annoying fly buzzing around his head.
And you, Master Dwarf?
My name's Grodd, and you're asking too many questions for a guide. Stick to leading the way and keep your nose out of my business, lad.
The air grew tense for a moment, but Arakos merely shrugged, his smirk unshaken.
I didn't mean to offend. Just making conversation.
Well, don't. I don't trust a man who talks more than he walks.
The dwarf grumbled under his breath, but fell silent, his irritation still simmering. Arakos, sensing the need to smooth things over, shifted the topic.
Speaking of working together, what kind of jobs have you all taken on before? Dungeon crawling? Escort missions? Or are you more the treasure hunting type?
He asked, his voice carrying a casual air. Tritan gave him a measured look.
A little of everything. What about you? How did you end up as a guide?
Arakos's expression didn't falter as he launched into the story he'd rehearsed countless times. He told them of his life as a hunter in Valicon, his contract with the local butcher, and how he'd turned to guiding travelers after his contract ended. His tone was steady, his words carefully chosen, but Lana watched him closely, her sharp instincts picking up on something amiss.
So you're just a hunter turned guide?
She asked, her tone almost too casual.
That's right. The work suits me. Plenty of time in the wild, and I get to help folks find their way.
Convenient.
Lana murmured, though she didn't press further. She filed away her doubts, deciding to keep a closer eye on him. As the sun began to set, the forest grew darker, and Arakos led them onto a narrower path.
This way. It's a shortcut. We'll save hours going this way.
Lana's unease deepened, but she said nothing. Instead, she stayed at the back, her senses on high alert as they followed the path into the growing shadows. The winding forest path grew darker as the group pressed on, the dense canopy above, allowing only slivers of fading sunlight to filter through. The once vibrant hum of wildlife was muted, replaced by an eerie silence. Tritan walked at the front, ever vigilant, though he couldn't shake the growing unease that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. Behind him, Mesra and Lana exchanged wary glances, each attuned in their own way to the wrongness in the air. Grodd trudged along, grumbling, while Ven hummed a soft tune, though even his usual humor seemed subdued. Arakos broke the silence.
You know, Tritan, I've heard a lot about fighters like you, strong, disciplined, noble even. But what drives you? Why take up the sword and lead others into danger?
Tritan glanced at him, his jaw tightening. The question felt pointed, almost probing.
Duty. I believe in protecting those who can't protect themselves.
A noble cause. But surely there's more to it than that. No one becomes a leader without a story. Loss? Revenge? Maybe just ambition?
Tritan slowed his pace slightly, letting the others draw closer as he studied the ranger.
Why do you ask?
Curiosity. You can learn a lot about people from their motivations. Makes it easier to understand how they tick.
Tritan didn't respond immediately, his instincts prickling. The ranger's words felt less like idle conversation and more like prying, as if he were trying to dissect the group. Before he could reply, Lana's sharp whisper cut through the tension.
Something's up in the trees.
Everyone stopped. Tritan followed her gaze, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. High above them, shadows shifted among the branches, too large to be mere animals. Mesra closed her eyes briefly, reaching out with her magical senses, and her voice came low and urgent.
There's something wrong here. The air. It's heavy, like a trap waiting to be sprung.
Arakos turned to them, his expression a mask of concern that didn't quite reach his eyes.
Probably just birds or squirrels. Nothing to worry about.
He said lightly. Grodd snorted.
Birds don't move like that, and squirrels don't carry crossbows.
No sooner had the words left his mouth than the ambush began. A sharp whistle pierced the air, and suddenly figures dropped from the trees, their forms blending with the shadows as they descended on the group. Vines were used as ropes, and the attackers, bandits armed with daggers, swords, and bows, moved with deadly precision.
Bandits!
Tritan shouted, drawing his sword and stepping in front of Mesra as a flurry of arrows rained down. The metallic clash of steel on steel rang out as the adventurers braced for the fight. Arakos stepped back, seemingly caught off guard.
What is this?
He exclaimed, though Lana caught the fleeting flicker of guilt in his eyes. She didn't have time to question it as a blade swiped toward her. She ducked, slashing back with her dagger and landing a quick, shallow cut on her assailant. Grodd roared, his battle axe swinging with ferocity as he cleaved through a bandit who had foolishly tried to rush him.
Come on, you cowards. You'll regret picking a fight with a dwarf.
Ven, for his part, darted and weaved through the chaos, snapping his whip like silver lightning.
Interesting. This isn't the welcoming party I was expecting. Oh, well, you can't figure on everything.
Mesra stood back, her hands glowing with arcane energy. She muttered an incantation, and a wave of force exploded outward, knocking several bandits off their feet.
We're outnumbered.
She called to Tritan.
We need to break through.
Tritan was in the thick of it, his blade carving a path through their attackers. He was a whirlwind of strength and precision, every strike calculated, every movement purposeful. Yet for every bandit he brought down, two more seemed to take their place. Lana darted toward Mesra, narrowly avoiding an arrow that whizzed past her ear.
We're being herded. This was a setup.
Mesra glanced toward Arakos, who had retreated to the edge of the fray. His sword was drawn, but he made no effort to engage the bandits. Her eyes narrowed as suspicion took root.
I think our guide knows more than he's letting on.
Before Lana could respond, another wave of bandits surged forward. Mesra raised her hands again, this time unleashing a burst of fire that forced their attackers to scatter. The momentary reprieve gave Tritan enough time to rally the group.
To the east! There's a gap. Let's head out.
The companions fought their way toward the opening, their movements desperate but coordinated. Grodd took the lead, his axe hewing through vines and bandits alike, while Mesra covered their retreat with a barrage of magical blasts. Ven stayed close to Lana, the two of them working in tandem to fend off any who got too close. As they neared the edge of the ambush site, an arrow grazed Tritan's shoulder, and he stumbled. Lana was at his side in an instant, pulling him upright.
Don't slow down now, fearless leader.
They burst through the tree line and into a clearing, their breaths ragged and their bodies battered. Mesra turned, her hands still glowing as she prepared to cast another spell, but the bandits didn't follow. Instead, they regrouped in the shadows, watching with predatory eyes as the adventurers fled. Once they were a safe distance away, Tritan rounded on Arakos, his sword still drawn.
What in the hell was that? You led us into a trap!
Arakos raised his hands defensively, his expression unreadable.
I had no idea. I swear I thought this was the right path.
Liar!
Lana spat, stepping forward.
You've been playing us from the start.
Tritan's grip on his sword tightened, but Mesra placed a calming hand on his arm.
We don't have time for this. We need to regroup and figure out our next move,
she said quietly. Reluctantly, Tritan lowered his weapon.
This isn't over, Arakos. If I find out you had anything to do with this, you'll regret it,
he warned. Arakos said nothing, his expression carefully neutral. The group moved on, their trust in their guide shattered, but their resolve unbroken. Behind them, the shadows of the forest seemed to close in, and the faint laughter of the bandits echoed through the trees like a sinister promise of what was to come. The aftermath of the ambush lingered like a heavy fog over the group as they trudged eastward, their pace slower now with their wounds and frayed nerves. Tritan led the way, his sharp eyes scanning the trees, every rustle of leaves or distant call of a bird setting him on edge. Arakos walked a few paces behind, his usual confidence subdued. The ranger had been unusually quiet since the escape, though his presence was still a source of tension. Lana walked next to Mesra, her sharp eyes darting around the forest while muttering under her breath.
Should have gutted him back there. I don't trust him.
She hissed softly, casting a glare at Arakos. Mesra gave a small nod, her voice low.
I don't either, but Tritan will handle it. For now, we need to focus on getting to Solister.
At the rear of the group, Grodd's heavy boots crunched against the dirt path as he muttered curses about everything from the ambush to the weather.
I've had enough of this accursed forest. If we don't see a proper bed and ale soon, I'm dragging that ranger by his ear all the way to Solister.
Charming as always, Grodd, though I'd pay good coin to see that.
Ven quipped, his usual sarcasm finding its way back. Grodd shot him a glare but said nothing, his hand gripping his great axe tighter, as though imagining it sinking into the ranger's skull. Finally, as the dense forest began to thin, the outline of a small city came into view on the horizon. Solister stood at the edge of a rolling plain, its modest stone walls weathered but sturdy. The gates were open, and the faint sounds of bustling life drifted toward them, a welcome change from the oppressive silence of the woods. Tritan let out a slow breath, the tension in his features easing, though not entirely vanishing.
We've made it,
he murmured, the words devoid of any real victory, his eyes, sharp and unwavering, fixed on Arakos, whose silence hung like a storm cloud between them.
This is where our paths diverge. You've done the job, and you've been paid. But don't mistake that for trust. If fate brings us together again...
Tritan draws out his sword and points it inches away from Arakos's neck.
It will be the death of you.
Arakos forces a strained smile, his movements stiff as he bows while moving slowly away from the point of Tritan's sword.
It has been my honor to serve you and your companions. Though I played no part in the recent misfortune, I offer my deepest apologies. It is a tragedy that we must part with bitterness lingering between us,
he says, his voice tinged with regret. With a final glance, Arakos turned on his heel and vanished into the shadowy embrace of the forest, his silhouette swallowed by the twisting trees. Tritan and his companions stood motionless, their eyes tracking his every step until the darkness claimed him. Only then, with wary hearts and unspoken tension lingering in the air, did they turn and stride toward the gates of Solister, the city's looming walls promising refuge. They passed through the gates without incident, the guards giving them a cursory glance before waving them in. The city streets were lively but not overwhelming, with merchants hawking wares and townsfolk going about their business. It was a far cry from the grandeur of Omeris, but it was clean, orderly, and inviting in its simplicity.
First order of business is food and rest. We'll deal with everything else after that,
Tritan said, addressing the group. It didn't take long for them to find a place that stood out, a quaint two-story establishment with a wooden sign swinging above the door that read, Clancy's Tavern and Inn. The building was well kept, with flower boxes under the windows and a warm glow emanating from inside.
Looks promising.
Tritan pushed open the door, the group stepping into a cozy, inviting interior. The scent of roasting meat and fresh bread filled the air, mingling with the faint tang of ale. A cheerful hum of conversation filled the room, though it quieted briefly as the adventurers entered, their battered appearance drawing a few curious looks. Behind the bar stood a tall, stout man with a full beard. His balding head caught the light as he looked up from polishing a mug. His sharp eyes took in the newcomers, and a wide grin spread across his face.
"Well now, you lot look like you've had quite the journey,"
he said, his voice rich and welcoming.
"Welcome to Clancy's Tavern and Inn. Name's Clancy Brewer, and you won't find better food, drink, or rooms in all of Solister."
Tritan approached the bar, offering a tired but polite nod.
Well met. We could use all three, Clancy. We've had a rough few days. I'm Tritan, and these are my companions, Mesra, Grod, Ven, and Lana.
Clancy's grins cheerfully, while shaking Tritan's hand and nodding at his companions.
"A pleasure meeting all of you."
Clancy observes their expressions while reaching for a few mugs from the shelves behind him.
"Rough few days, you say? I can tell. You lot have that look about you, like you've been through a forest full of trouble and came out the other side."
His gaze flicked to Grod, who was already eyeing the ale taps.
"And you, my dwarf friend, appear that you can use a pint."
I could use several.
Grod grunted, slapping a hand on the counter and sliding a gold coin at Clancy's direction.
Start pouring, lad.
Clancy chuckled, pulling a pint with practiced ease and sliding it toward the dwarf.
"You've got spirit, friend. I like that."
The group found seats at a table near the hearth, where the warmth of the fire began to ease their weary bodies. Clancy soon returned with a tray of steaming stew, salad, and fresh bread, setting it down with a flourish.
"On the house! You lot look like you need it more than I need the coin."
Tritan nods his head in gratitude.
Thank you. We'll make sure to pay for the rooms.
Clancy waved a hand dismissively.
"We'll sort that out later. For now, eat, drink, and rest. You've earned it."
As they dug into the meal, Clancy lingered, his natural curiosity shining through.
"So, what brings you fine folk to Solister? Not every day we get adventurers passing through."
Tritan hesitated, but Ven was quick to answer.
Oh, you know, the usual. Monsters, treasure, and life-threatening danger. We like to keep things exciting.
Clancy laughed, a deep booming sound.
"Well, you've come to the right place. Plenty of work for folk like you around here, though you might want to steer clear of the eastern woods. Nasty business out that way."
Lana's eyes narrowed slightly.
What kind of nasty business?
"Bandits. Been more active lately. Word is they've got a camp somewhere in the forest, but no one's been able to root them out."
The group exchanged glances, tension returning to the table. Clancy seemed to notice the unease and clapped his hands.
"But enough of that talk. You're safe here, and that's what matters."
After the meal, Clancy showed them to their rooms, simple but clean and comfortable. As Tritan settled into his bed, his thoughts remained troubled. The ambush Arakos's suspicious behavior, and now the mention of bandits, it all felt connected. But for now, they needed rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and they needed to be ready. The next morning, the warm hum of the bustling tavern provided a comfortable backdrop as Tritan and his companions gathered at their usual table. The aroma of roasted meats and fresh bread filled the air as they enjoyed a simple breakfast. Ven strummed his lute idly, creating a soothing melody, while Mesra sipped her tea in comfort. Grodd, always practical, was busy polishing his axe between bites of his meal.
We've got coin enough for now, but we'll need another gig soon,
Tritan mentioned, his tone pensive as he leaned back in his chair.
Hopefully something that pays better than our last quest.
Lana quipped, stretching lazily before rising from her seat. She grabbed her steaming mug of coffee and strolled toward the quest board at the far side of the room. As she scanned the board, her sharp eyes landed on a lone parchment pinned haphazardly near the bottom. Taking a sip of her coffee, she leaned closer, reading aloud to herself. She sighed, frowning at the lack of lucrative options, but tore the posting down anyway. Returning to the table, she dropped the notice in front of Tritan.
Slim pickings this morning. This is all they've got. Farmers lost some animals. Doesn't sound like much, and the pay probably matches.
Grodd glanced up from his axe with a grunt.
I can't believe we've come this far only to find chickens for a farmer.
Mesra picked up the notice and skimmed it.
It's not glamorous, but it could be worth investigating. Sometimes these small jobs uncover bigger opportunities.
Tritan rubbed his chin, his mind already turning over possibilities.
Missing livestock. Could be wild animals, or it could be something more organized.
After a brief deliberation, the group agreed to take on the job. By mid-morning, they were on the road, the sun climbing higher as they made their way to the outskirts of Solister. The Brentwood homestead came into view, a modest collection of wooden structures surrounded by fields and pastures. As they approached, a weathered man in his mid-60s stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a cloth.
Morning. Are you the ones answering my posting?
Tritan stepped forward, extending a hand.
We are. Name's Tritan, and these are my companions. We understand you've been having some trouble.
The farmer shook his hand firmly while nodding at the others.
Willard Brentwood, well met. 2 nights ago, I lost some of my stock. 2 pigs, 3 goats, and a few horses gone without a trace. Well, almost.
Almost?
Mesra asked, stepping closer with interest. Willard nodded and gestured for them to follow.
Over here,
he said, leading them to a muddy section near the edge of the property. He pointed to a series of dried footprints in the dirt, some large, others smaller, crisscrossing the area.
Looks like more than one person. Maybe someone took the animals and disappeared into the night, but I'm not sure. I've no idea who or why.
Tritan crouched down, studying the footprints. The prints were irregular, like they were hurried, possibly trying to move livestock quickly.
Bandits,
he muttered under his breath. Tritan stood, brushing the dirt from his hands.
We were ambushed by bandits yesterday near this area, leading me to believe that they are operating near this location.
Not surprising. And it would be satisfying for me to have a go at them again.
Grodd said, hefting his great axe onto his shoulder. Willard's eyes widened.
Bandits, it makes sense now. Should I be worried?
Tritan placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder.
We'll look into it for you. If it is bandits, we'll deal with them. You have my word.
The woods were quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. Tritan and his companions moved cautiously, each step carefully placed to avoid snapping twigs or crunching dried leaves underfoot. Tritan led the way, his eyes sharp in the dim light of the early evening, followed by Mesra walking carefully with each step, while Grodd carried his great axe at the ready, his grip tightening with anticipation. Lana flitted from shadow to shadow like a wraith, her hands instinctively brushing the hilts of her daggers. Ven hummed a quiet tune to himself, though even he was uncharacteristically focused. They followed the trail of footprints out of the farmstead and deeper into the wooded area. As they crept forward, the faint glow of firelight came into view, flickering between the trees. Tritan raised his hand, signaling the group to halt.
Looks like we found our culprits.
Lana whispered, her tone sharp with tension. Tritan squinted, his hand tightening on the hilt of his sword. Around the campfire, 6 figures stood in tense conversation. One of them, tall and draped in a dark cloak, turned slightly, and Tritan felt a jolt of recognition.
Arakos.
He muttered, his voice a low growl. The group watched in silence as Arakos gestured emphatically, speaking in hushed tones with the 5 hooded bandits. Lana crept closer, crouching low to the ground, her sharp ears catching fragments of their conversation. She returned to the group, moments later, her expression grim.
They're planning another raid. More livestock, and they're talking about branching out to caravans,
she murmured. Tritan's jaw tightened. He exchanged a glance with Mesra, who gave a subtle nod. Without a word, he raised his hand and signaled the group to fan out. The time for stealth had passed. They moved quickly, weapons drawn. Tritan's voice rang out like thunder as they burst into the clearing.
Arakos, you treacherous snake!
The bandits scrambled to their feet, drawing weapons, but they were no match for the seasoned adventurers. Grodd's axe cleaved through the first bandit's blade and deep into his chest, while Lana darted behind another, her daggers flashing as she struck with lethal precision. Mesra raised her hands, chanting in a low, melodic tone, as a surge of fiery energy burst forth, engulfing 2 of the bandits in a searing explosion. Arakos drew his sword, but his movements were slow, hesitant. Tritan advanced on him with measured steps, parrying a desperate strike before driving his blade into a bandit who tried to blindside him. Then, cracking his whip with dramatic flair, dispatched the final hooded figure, leaving only Arakos alive. The traitor fell to his knees, blood seeping from a deep wound in his side. His sword slipped from his grasp as he raised his hands in a pitiful gesture of surrender.
Please, mercy, I'll tell you whatever you want.
Tritan's sword hovered inches from Arakos's throat, his eyes burning with fury, but his voice was cold as steel.
The livestock from the farmer you took from a couple of nights ago. Where is it?
Arakos coughed, blood flecking his lips.
The southern cave. It's hidden there, just past the river. You'll find them all.
Tritan nodded slowly, lowering his sword for a moment, but then his expression darkened.
I warned you, Arakos. If we crossed paths again, it wouldn't end well for you.
Arakos's eyes widened in horror.
Wait!
The blade flashed, and the traitor's life ended in silence. Tritan stood over Arakos's lifeless form, his breathing steady as he wiped the blood from his sword. The others gathered around, their expressions grim but resolute. As they left his body, Lana carefully and quickly rifled through the dead ranger's body, along with the bodies of the dead bandits, looting gold coins and other valuables before rejoining her companions. It wasn't long before they found the southern cave, just as Arakos had described. Inside, the missing livestock were penned in crude enclosures, frightened but unharmed. To their surprise, they also discovered several small pouches of gold coins tucked away in the corner, partially buried under a thin layer of dirt. Grodd and Ven worked quickly to free the farm animals, while Lana and Mesra assisted. They guided the creatures back toward the farmstead, their movements slow and cautious through the woods. When they returned to Willard Brentwood's homestead, the farmer rushed out to meet them, his face lighting up with relief and gratitude.
You found them. I can't thank you enough. I thought I'd lost everything.
Tritan clasped the farmer's hand firmly.
Your livestock are safe now. The bandits won't trouble you again.
Willard shook his head in disbelief.
You've done more than I could have hoped for. Here,
He pulled a small pouch of coins from his pocket and pressed it into Triton's hand.
It's not much, but it's all I can give.
Triton glanced at the pouch but handed it back with a slight smile.
Keep it. I believe you need it more than we do.
Willard's eyes glistened, and he quickly nodded.
Then let me do something else to show my thanks. You all must be starving after the day you've had. Please join me for a home-cooked meal. It's the least I can do.
The group exchanged glances before Grodd spoke up, grinning.
Now that is an offer we won't refuse.
That evening, the group sat around the farmer's dining table, sharing a hearty, home-cooked meal of roasted pork, fresh vegetables, and warm bread. The laughter and warmth of the evening stood in stark contrast to the bloodshed earlier, but for now, they allowed themselves to relax, knowing they had made a difference.